Hey, hi everyone. We are going to get started. So hello and welcome to Livre Canada Books' webinar on demystifying metadata for international sales. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Today's presentation will be given in English and should take about 60 minutes, including time set aside at the end for your questions. La présentation d'aujourd'hui sera en anglais et devrait durer environ 60 minutes. Nous avons prévu du temps à la fin pour répondre à vos questions. Pour accéder à l'interprétation vers le français, cliquez sur l'icône Interprétation au bas de votre écran. Dans les commandes pour la réunion, l'icône ressemble à un globe et par la suite, sélectionnez la langue de votre choix. For those who do not require interpretation or who will be listening in English, please leave the interpretation feature off. After the presentation is complete, we'll be taking questions in both languages via the Q&A function, not in the chat. So it should be visible on your screens. Feel free to submit your questions through the webinar and we will collect them from the Q&A session at the end. Alors, nous vous invitons à poser vos questions via la fonction questions-réponses. N'hésitez pas à soumettre vos questions tout au long du webinaire. Nous les recueillerons pour la séance de questions qui aura lieu à la fin. If you encounter any problems or have any questions relating to the platform, please message me as the host individually via the chat function. Si vous rencontrez des problèmes ou si vous avez des questions au sujet de la plateforme, veuillez m'envoyer un message privé en tant que hôte. We are very pleased to be hosting today's webinar, providing key insights on using metadata to boost your international sales. Creating and disseminating good book metadata is key to making titles available across international markets and the global book supply chain. Yet it can be challenging to use metadata to its full potential, including using standard specifications to communicate up-to-date information about international right sales and territories. Today's presentation will provide an overview of best practices using metadata to effectively communicate title information to international distributors and booksellers. I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Craig Riggs, who will be providing us with some guidance on using metadata to sell and promote your books in international markets. Now, many of you already know Craig from his many years in the book industry. He is a principal in the industry consultancy Turner Riggs and a co-founder of ReaderBound, a specialized builder of customized e-commerce websites for book publishers. His current portfolio emphasizes the development of new web platforms, publishing technology, and reader engagement. He leads the 49thshelf.com project for the Association of Canadian Publishers and is actively engaged in commissioned research on book marketing, book discovery, and consumer behavior. He holds a master's in publishing and is an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. Welcome, Craig, and thank you for joining us today. I'll turn the mic over to you now so that you can get started.
Thanks very much, Tristan, and welcome in everyone. Really great that you can join us this afternoon. As Tristan says, we'll try to reserve some time later in the session for Q&A. I often find that time gets compressed. So if you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to add them in the Q&A function here in the Zoom. If we can't address them during our session time today, we certainly will do outside of the call and make sure that we provide you with some follow-up detail. Speaking of which, everybody's going to get a copy of the slide deck, as you would expect from today's session. It has, you're going to see a number of sort of detailed examples in the deck as we work through today. And I hope you'll find those helpful. There's also a bunch of linked resources in there that can point you to some additional guidance and documentation on how to address some of the different types of data parameters that we're gonna talk about today. So with that, I thought I might start by just introducing myself a little bit, as Tristan's already given you my bio, and I don't mean to read you my resume at all, but I just would like you to understand or to have a sense of my perspective on bibliographic data, how it's composed and how it moves through the supply chain. I've worked in the industry for about 20, coming up on 25 years now, and the last 18 years or so, I've been working across the industry as an independent consultant with individual presses and with industry groups like ACP and others. So it's within the last 10 to 15 years in particular, a lot of that work has evolved around book discovery and especially discovery and discoverability in the online space. I've been involved in building some large web properties, especially those that are concerned with boosting the visibility of Canadian books in the marketplace. Um, and we also support a large number of sites for individual presses in Canada and in the US. And across all of those projects, the perspective that that has left me with is one of a recipient of bibliographic metadata. This is, of course, a clever visual metaphor for catching a bunch of metadata. But it's on some of those projects we have like 49 Shelf, for example, is a project that's fed by Onyx data from literally hundreds of publishers and distributors. There would be about 100 and just over 150,000 ISBNs on that site today. And it gives us a window into a pretty large sample of data as it's being moved around the supply chain. So we're always trying to understand better what data is being provided, so how it's coming through, and how we can use it to showcase the books that we're representing across those different types of web properties. So for those that haven't seen it, this is an example. This is our 49shelf.com homepage. This is a site that's specifically concerned with boosting the visibility of Canadian books. And as I say, there are about 150,000 books on there today. 49 Shelf is a consumer-facing platform, but I've also thought of it all the way along. This is a project that's been running now for about 12 years. And all the way along, I've felt that one of the really important things that it has done is given us a very concrete, in fact, a series of very concrete use cases for expanding the quality and depth of metadata that Canadian presses were putting into the supply chain. We were able to, go out and work with presses across the country to draw different types of data points into a site like this and to show how they can be used. And that is work that continues today. That's a kind of never-ending journey in terms of, additional types of data that can be used to highlight books, to give readers new ways to find them and discover them. And so we're always engaged across the industry on those types of questions, sort of how can we push that a little bit further and make the books visible in different ways. Kristen mentioned I'm a co-founder in a company called Readerbound, which builds sites for individual publishing houses. And there we also push this idea as far as we can. And on the publisher's own site, you have a great deal of flexibility to express your list in ways that you can't do in many other places across the supply chain. But these sites are all fed out of the Onyx data that the presses produce, and we look for ways to tune that data and to expand it further to reflect, the distinct characteristics of the publisher's list. And in this example that we see, this is a set of custom subject indices that we developed in collaboration with the team at Playwright Canada Press, which, as many people on the call will know, is concerned entirely with publishing drama titles. And we were able to work out some really interesting and distinct structures in the data for how we could really open up that catalog and make it easier for readers to explore the scripts that were available within that list. This is a new project that we're working on these days for eBound Canada, and it's something called the Canadian Digital Library Collection. And I draw it to your attention because it is a early example in the Canadian marketplace of a site that is leveraging a number of new types of data points, and a number of which we'll talk about today. This down the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a series of different filters and parameters by which users can explore the catalog. This is a largish catalog of about 20,000 books, and it's a catalog that's aimed very squarely at public librarians. And so kind of a specialist user community. And we're trying to give them a expanded toolkit for exploring this catalog, including the opportunity to search or to browse on different parameters around accessibility. There's a number of different elements of custom data in here, but we're also doing things like matching together different types of classification schemes like BISAC and THEMA, which is certainly topics that we'll touch on today. And what we're trying to demonstrate in doing so is that there's a lot of power in those additional data attributes, and that the more that we can populate those and and leverage them to allow readers, or in this case, librarians, different ways to discover books or to filter a large catalog to fit their particular interests, then we've landed on something very powerful indeed. So obviously, there's an interaction between projects like this and the work that's being done at individual presses across the country, and indeed the way that industry practice around some of these data parameters is taking shape, right? So there's a couple of sort of early concrete illustrations that we can reflect on as we go on to think about now how we would tune data for the international marketplace. And of course, that is our large subject for today. Um, how you would expand or improve the quality and depth of the bibliographic metadata that you're putting into the supply chain for specifically for international markets. That's a big topic, needless to say. Or I think perhaps I know I haven't met everybody on the call, but I see a number of familiar names on the attendee list, and certainly there are folks on the call today that have considerable and specific expertise in this area, and would invite you to share your comments as well as we go through the session today. But what I'm going to do in terms of tackling that large subject is break it down into three components. One, kind of some basic considerations that your data has to reflect as you step outside of the Canadian marketplace. In the second section of the session today, we'll look at some of the regulatory aspects of metadata, so particularly that are coming out of the EU, that place additional compliance requirements on presses that are selling and marketing books in those territories. And then in third and final stop on the tour, we'll look at the different types of market-specific data that you can put into your Onyx record to support the sales and marketing of your work across national territories. Now, if you're someone who is responsible for managing metadata in your publishing house, that probably already feels like a lot, right? Let's acknowledge that. So please let me say this. I'm not the person that's going to tell you that you need to have all of this in place for your entire catalog right away. I have never met in my life an underworked publishing team. I realize that adding any amount of new data to your Onyx feed can be a large effort for any press. So what I would invite you to do today as we go through is to reflect on which of these elements is most relevant to your list and to your international marketing priorities. That is to say, the international markets where you're working or that you're aiming to work, and then prioritize the data elements that you want to focus on based on that. The best practice in terms of building your Onyx feed is to adopt a process of continuous improvement, right? I'm sure many of you do that as it is. But that's best supported by a deliberate plan that says, we're going to work on this element first, and then the next, and so on from there. So please don't feel like this is a session that's setting you up for, an endless list of things that you have to find a way to address in the near future in your Onyx feed. I would encourage you to take a long view and to really build that capacity within the press and within your Onyx database for how you can tune your data for international markets. Okay. That said, let's start at the start. And there are a couple of important things to highlight, I think, the moment that you step outside of the Canadian marketplace. And that is the use of the Onyx 3.1 standard and the use of thema. So we're going to touch on both of these a fair bit as we go along through the session today. But I wanted to highlight them for you because if you are primarily working in the Canadian marketplace, particularly in the English language market in Canada, or in that English language market in the US, it's possible for you to carry on business without giving a great deal of attention to either of these things, right? As I mentioned, we have through some of our other projects a sort of broad view of the data supply chain. And certainly we do see more Onyx 3 data now coming through than we used to even a couple of years ago. And certainly we do see more thema as well. But the fact is that in the English language market in Canada and in the US, we are still heavily reliant on the Onyx 2.1 standard, which is technically a kind of deprecated standard that's no longer supported. but it's widely used in North America. And the same is true of the BISAC classification scheme, the category scheme that BISG produces. It's it's very widely adopted and it's very well used and very effective, but its use is limited largely to the English language market in Canada and to the US market. So once you step outside of those territories, you need a different way to transmit your data and you need a different way to classify your catalog. And that's where ONIX 3.1 and Thema comes in. So sorry, I should have skipped to this slide, and I realized a moment ago, but just to say that the point being here that data recipients outside of North America essentially will require ONIX 3.1. So when we look at data coming out of Quebec, it's mostly in 3.1, and that the standard has very clearly been adopted by publishers in the French language market in Canada. Like I say, less so in the English language market. There are, however, some real significant advantages in the 3.1 standard. First of all, it's more of a living standard and it continues to kind of evolve and improve over time. But even, out of the box today, it provides some really important improvements over 2.1 in terms of expanded support for regional classifications, like you can be more detailed and explaining where your authors are from, what part of the country they're connected to, expanded support for digital editions, which is ever more important, and much improved supply. One of the things that I mostly pay attention to around 3.1 is much improved supplier detail by market. So you can, in the same ONIX record, you can provide really rich supplier detail that's parsed out by national market. Here's our detail for the US, here it is for the UK, and so on and so on. And that is a significant leap forward in 3.1 that, and we'll see some other tricks that we can do with 3.1 over the course of the session today. But all things that are, material improvements over over 2.1, aside from the fact that recipients outside of North America are basically going to require you to do 3.1 as it is. So most presses are using ONIX tools, ONIX databases, and related services that can generate feeds in both formats, 2.1 and 3.1. But the question I would ask of you, or ask you to ask yourselves, is that, producing a 3.1 ONIX record is one thing, but are you really reflecting on, some of those material improvements in 3.1 relative to 2.1? Are you really taking advantage of some of the new opportunities that are there in that 3.1 standard? And a lot of presses will do the same. Is true of Thema, incidentally, as we'll explore in a moment. But a lot of presses are doing a kind of simple transposition of like that 2.1 data into a 3.1 record, and off it goes, but not necessarily exploiting some of the additional features of the 3.1 standard. And I think as you begin to approach international markets, there's certainly an opportunity there to do so, and in fact, a requirement to do so in some respects. As I say, the same could be said of Thema. This is for folks that are, we don't see a ton of Thema data, frankly, in the supply chain still, at least in the English language market in Canada. As I say, it's pretty well adopted in the French language market, but it is, think of it as a more extensive international classification scheme for books that rides alongside BISAC. Whereas you can use BISAC in the English language market in Canada and in the US, you can use Thema internationally. And it is in its design an international book subject classification scheme. So it's fairly extensive. It has thousands of core subject classifications, and then another plus or minus 1,000 what are called qualifier codes, which are just ways to characterize the subject code assignment that you're making otherwise. The codes are themselves language independent. There are 25 official translations of the Thema code set as it is now. And the end result is that it represents a more flexible model to add meaning and classifications and boost discovery. Just to be a little more concrete about that in one aspect, that eBound project that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we're trying to do there is use Thema data So in thema, you'll notice that if you spend any time sort of exploring the thema standard at all, you'll notice that there's a fair bit in there in the way of sort of geographic classifications of a work. And this, you know, rings a bell for me because it's something that we've struggled with for a long time. A number of our projects, as I said earlier, are concerned with boosting the visibility of Canadian work, right? And so obviously there's a kind of place aspect to doing so. We want to be able to say something about where that work is based. We want to be able to say something about where the author is from. We want to be able to say if the work is, let's say, if the work of nonfiction, if it's about a particular, community or part of the country, we want to be able to say something about that. It's really, really hard to do so using tools like BISAC or otherwise. The only way that we've done it historically in recent history, working around some of these projects, is to put kind of a layer of kind of custom geographic data on top of the Onyx data that's coming through from the publishers. That's a very clumsy and hard to scale way to deal with that question. But in Thema, there's just a ton of geographic qualifiers and subject references that you can put on your Onyx record that give quite a bit of rich detail about all of those things. Where's the author from? Where's the book set? What part of the country is the book about? It becomes a very powerful device and a very meaningful device, actually, by which readers can discover the work. And it's amazing when you think about it that we haven't had that capability necessarily in the supply chain before. But this is the kind of tool that opens that up. And that's why we're using it on things like that event collection to try and have a kind of standardized, scalable way to address that subject. Oh, sorry, Gabriella, did you have a question? Oh, no, might have been an accidental button push. Okay, so on we go. That's Thema. Well, let's take a little bit of a closer look at what Thema looks like as in the structure of it and as it's established in the data record. So this is just one of the links that you'll see on the deck here is a link to a browser lookup for Thema, and you can use that just to kind of click through and explore the entire Thema subject structure. But this is the top level view on screen right now of what that structure looks like. And here is what it looks like more at the individual book level. So here's a work that's originally published in Japanese, and we see alongside that the English language and Spanish language versions of the same title. And what you'll notice is that in each of the three cases, we're using the same Thema subject codes in each language, for each language. But because those codes are themselves translated across multiple languages, we can give those descriptors in the language of the marketplace. So whether that's Japanese or whether it's a Spanish language market or an English language market, you're populating the code once and it gets expressed out depending on the recipient in all of those different languages that are supported across the standard, right? So it's really, that in itself is an amazing capability that comes from the Thema classification scheme, right? And just to drill down into a little more detail still, here's a kind of side-by-side comparison of how you might categorize the same book. In this case, it's a travel guide for Nigeria. How you might characterize the same book in using the BISEC scheme as opposed to Thema, right? And you begin to get a sense that, oh, right, Thema can be a much more flexible structure, right? In BISEC, you have this kind of what sometimes is called pre-coordinated or predetermined kind of code structure that says, oh, you have to select this code, and it's a pointer to a bookstore. I mean, remembering that BISAC is essentially a guide to advise bookstores as to where books can be shelved, right? If we move outside of that shelf environment into an online discovery environment, as most of our books are found in now, we might want something that goes beyond that. And that's where Thema becomes really powerful, right? So here we're scratching the surface. We're saying on the one hand, yeah, this is a travel guide and it's about Nigeria, but you can imagine you can lay a bunch of additional codes on that. And here's an example of a children's title that has many more codes attached that first of all, makes it clear this is a illustrated children's book and here's who it's for. And then you start to see all kinds of interest, age, and place qualifiers, and even cultural festivals or holidays are referenced here, referencing specific communities or interest groups that might that are relevant to the work. These are all thema codes that you can lay on top of that initial this is a children's illustrated children's book to really provide a lot more rich meaning and discovery cues for both for search engines or systems that are inhaling this data as well as readers that encounter it subsequently, right? So it's a simple example, but I think a telling one in terms of how much further you can push classification using a scheme like this that's a bit more extensible and flexible. Right? Okay, so that's probably enough about thema. But what I mentioned earlier that most presses will have the capability to produce both 2.1 and 3.1 feeds. Most presses also have the capability to populate some basic thema codes. And a lot of times when we do see thema coming across in the data supply, it's fairly apparent that it's a lot of it is a product of simple conversion tools, right? There are conversion tools out there that will map like BISAC codes to the corresponding thema codes, right? And that's fine as far as it goes, but it's kind of like that, you know, basic adaptation to a 3.1 Onyx record that we were talking about earlier. That if you're just relying strictly on that conversion tool, then you're not really tapping into some of the rich opportunity that's there in the thema classification scheme, right? The data that you're sending out is more rudimentary, it's incomplete. And in that sense, you're probably leaving something on the table in terms of connecting that book with readers in the way that you would want to do, right? So so this is really an invitation today to just look more closely at that thema structure and to reflect on how it fits into your own professional practice around how you're managing the Onyx data for your press, and to think about where you can push it further, right, in a way that's manageable for you. Okay. So that brings us along to our next stop on the tour, which is the areas of international metadata that are affected by regulations, right? We're all aware that there are a number of regulations that set up new requirements for metadata that's moving across international markets, especially in terms of regulations that are coming out of the European Union. It's important to say that even though these are EU regulations or directives, they are having an important shaping effect on international markets in terms of market expectations for the types of data that's being supplied. And in some cases, these regulations also explicitly reach beyond the EU because of trading agreements or other bilateral or multilateral protocols between the EU and non-EU countries, right? So there are three areas of EU regulation that we should look at today. And here they are. These are regulations that apply uniformly in all member countries, and as I say, they can stretch beyond the EU or the European Economic Area as well. But the three that we're going to be concerned with today are regs around product safety, around accessibility. So here we're talking about ebooks, and sustainability. And here we're talking about print books, right? So these, again, depending on what books you are marketing where, you may need to give more or less weight to compliance with these different regulations. The product safety item is reasonably straightforward. Maybe sorry, I should say just by way of a prelude that it's almost a cliche to think of the EU as a as an extremely bureaucratic organization that comes complete with lots of regulatory demands like this. But there's a point behind it that we shouldn't lose track of, that these are regulations that are concerned with um, promoting a marketplace that is more equitable. So think about accessibility, for example, so that everybody can participate equally and can have the opportunity to have access to work that's important to them. Um, it's also these are regulations that are also informed by ideas like transparency. So like the product safety regulation, for example, is really just ensuring that you identify yourself as the producer of whatever the product is, right? So and that that's done consistently and in a very visible way, so that if there is any issue, that they know who to reach out to. And with sustainability, the same thing. They're just trying to promote a obviously there's an aspect of there's an environmental aspect to that, but it's also promoting an aspect of transparency in the marketplace as well in terms of the types of products that are being used or made available to consumers. So that's really the backdrop for these as we drill down into them. Um, the let's see, we'll just take them in turn. The one for anybody that's selling finished books into the EU, the this first one around deforestation is somebody you may have seen the news about this recently. It was scheduled for implementation at the end of last year, at the end of 24. And they decided in a late in the year through there was a scheduled vote that led to the implementation being delayed for a year. So it's getting pushed back to December, the end of 25 for larger enterprises and till the midpoint in 2026 for small businesses. Most Canadian publishers would fall under the definition of small or medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, in the EU. So what that means is that the effective date for compliance for most people on this call is probably June 30th, 2026. On the one hand, you could heave a sigh of relief and think that's it. We don't have to worry about that for now. And it's true, it's not an immediate thing. But I think there's a bit of work associated with this. And the reason for the delay is in large part to give people a greater opportunity to get things organized so they can be compliant by the time the new dates come around. So the premise here is that the products that you're putting into the marketplace have to be deforestation free. You're if you're putting any finished product into the EU marketplace, you have to file what's called a due diligence statement with the EU, and then you use your Onyx to refer to that filing, right? So that there's a bit of a process behind the Onyx record here, but you use I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with sort of the attribute in Onyx product form feature type. Well, now there's an extension of that that allows you to provide details about this kind of compliance requirement directly within the Onyx record. It's going to look, whoops, hang on. There we go. It's going to look something like that in execution in terms of how it comes out of your Onyx. We don't have to worry about drilling down into this in more detail today. I don't think this is one of the linked resources that you're going to find in the deck. And for anyone that wants to dig into it further, there's good background there to guide you in that respect. But just to highlight that in this case, compliance arises from a specific due diligence filing that you make with the EU and that you then reference in your Onyx, right? And now we've got about 17 months to get our ducks in a row in this respect. But as anyone who's working with metadata on the call will know for sure, this stuff can sneak up on you. So I wouldn't let it go too long. If you are selling finished books into the EU, this is the time to start working on this. Okay. I mentioned the safety regulation as well, the GPSR, General Product Safety Regulation. This one is in effect now. It just came into effect last month. And it's not very complex, but it does require that you provide some expanded detail on the press in the Onyx record, specifically name of the press and some expanded contact details. This is a little bit tricky because this attribute is not well supported outside of Onyx 3.1. But if you're sending a 3.1 record, there's good support for this now. And this is what that would look like as it's coming out. You're using a product contact composite to comply with this regulation and to provide that expanded contact detail, right? And again, we won't bother with this too much more right now because there's lots of good detail and documentation on this. I think this is probably obvious to everybody on the call, but some of the examples that I'm showing here are drawn from the official guidance that comes around these regulations and and other aspects of metadata that are provided by Editor, which is the international organization that is responsible for establishing and maintaining some of these standards. They do an excellent job, as does BookNet Canada here and BTLF here in Canada, or BISG in the States. They do an excellent job of sharing best practice guidelines in each of these areas. And so for everything that I'm talking about today, there is detailed and authoritative guidance on that item available to you just a click away on the editor website, right? And again, you're going to find links to a number of those in the resources for this session. So that is the relatively straightforward general product safety regulation requirement. Just get your contact information using this product contact composite into the Onyx record, and all will be well. Okay. And the last one, and in some respects, a more complex item, but also a more broadly applicable item, is the regulatory requirement for accessibility detail in the Onyx arising from the European Accessibility Act. This is scheduled for implementation at the midpoint of this year, so the end of June 25. It applies to all digital editions that you're putting into the marketplace. And it requires you essentially to describe the accessibility features of the work within the Onyx. And there's a couple of relatively straightforward ways to do this. The quick part of this and the easy part to explain is there's a couple key code lists that I've noted here that you would reference for the attributes that you would use to describe the accessibility features of the work. The more complex part is how you actually do that. This is a this is an area. So when I said earlier that on 49 Shell, for example, we're always encountering new types of data or new requirements or new opportunities that we can use to show work in different ways. This is a great example. Like we're seeing, partly because of the EU regulation, we are seeing more accessibility data coming through in the data supply these days. Not as much, frankly, as we would like to see, but certainly year over year, we're seeing significant gains in this area. And, here in Canada, there have been, like, for example, Canadian Heritage had a significant project on to boost work around accessibility of Canadian ebooks. And a number of presses across the country have, at their own initiative, pursued different types of certifications with Benetech or otherwise to demonstrate the level of play within their press in terms of accessibility. And so as an extension of some of those efforts, we're seeing, that presses are putting more and more of this data into their Onyx feeds these days. Here's what that looks like this is just a fragment of an Onyx record. And it provides you with a variety of code references, each of which pertains to a different aspect of accessibility of the work. Some of these are concerned with, if you have a quick scan of these code lists, you'll get a sense right away that some of them are concerned with sort of functional characteristics of the work. Is it reflowable text as opposed to a fixed page format? So basically like an EPUB as opposed to a PDF. Are there different types of features available? Can text be resized? Is there supporting alt content for charts and tables and things like that? Sometimes there's quite a level of specificity there. In other cases, as you can see at the bottom of this example, sometimes what you'll get is like an attestation that the work complies like with a certain accessibility standard, right? So it might be a standard that relates to EPUB production, or it might be a standard that relates, that derives from the WCAG set of standards. If anybody's done any work in accessibility on ebooks or websites or otherwise, there's all sorts of formal standards out there and various levels of standardization for accessibility, and you can reflect all of that in the Onyx record for the work. I would say, frankly, that this is an area of metadata practice that is at an early stage in Canada and elsewhere, actually. a lot of people want to do this and want to do it well. But frankly, I think we're at a point in the across the industry where we're just kind of learning how to do it. There aren't a lot of uniform ideas about how to do this work and how to supply this kind of detail. The most important sort of best practice that I've come across in this area is that the idea that you should be as detailed as possible. And in terms of the how you describe the accessibility of the work in question, recognizing that there's not just one type of reader out there that will be interested in that. There's not just one type of, let's say, print disabled reader, right? People have quite a wide range of requirements and even equipment that they would use to access the work. And so, a feature that's important to one person may be less important to the next. And so important to just be as complete as you can in terms of how you describe that information. When you're talking to a specialist audience, like in the case of the eBound collection that I highlighted earlier, you might be able to make more use of things like a WCAG 2.0 level AA reference, right? It's if you're a librarian that's working in that field, you probably have a pretty good sense of what that standard represents. An end consumer may not, and you may need to be more explicit about what you're offering in that respect. Here, by the way, is what that looks like when it comes out the other end of the data supply chain. This is a user-facing title listing for a book that has some accessibility detail provided. And again, there's sort of some important emerging practice in this area in terms of how you represent these raw code values for an end user, right? We're using specific terms here that are with the expectation that those will be meaningful across a wide population of users and that they will help provide useful guidance to people that are trying to understand the accessibility characteristics of the work, right? So I would say that as it relates to compliance with EU regulations, but also as a matter of general practice, as you are putting accessible work into the domestic or international marketplace, this is a increasingly important aspect to address in your Onyx record. And there are going to be more and more opportunities in the marketplace, such as the example we're seeing here, to make use of that information and display it to end users to help them make an informed choice about the work that they're selecting, but also to provide this quite naturally becomes another way that users can search and discover work across quite a growing field of websites where this work is being displayed. And so yeah, it becomes another basis for selection, right? Which can be really important. So those are our regulatory items to have in focus in terms of tuning metadata for the international marketplace. The product safety regs that are now in effect, the accessibility regulations that will be in effect later this year, and the sustainability regulations that for most presses will kick in the midpoint of 2026. Okay. Alrighty. So that is enough about regulations. And I wanted just to take our last moments today to talk about a different category of metadata altogether. This is nothing to do with regulations or sort of basic standards that you're going to apply for transmitting data to international markets, but it has to do with the market-specific information that you put into the Onyx record. And I think we have to recognize that when you step outside of the Canadian marketplace, that you're entering into a more complex and varied marketplace. And it's important to provide some additional guiding detail in the Onyx record so that that book can travel properly in the way that you intend from market to market. Okay, so here's a few, aside from, use Onyx 3.1, make sure you've got some good thema codes in place. Here are the other basic considerations for internationalizing your data. First of all, obviously, you would supply all weights and measures in metric. This is really not a big deal. Most Onyx systems readily convert, inches and pounds to centimeters and grams. So I don't think that anybody's going to spend a lot of time worrying about that. But just as a kind of, again, a basic consideration, most of the world is using metric. If you're sending weights and measures out, make sure they're in metric, please. Uh, Next is sales rights. So this is here, we're not talking about subsidiary rights or anything like that. We're talking about the right of sale of the work in a given territory. So you want to, in your Onyx record, demonstrate that you have the right to sell book X in country Y, right? That you haven't sold those rights away or anything of the sort. And so the Onyx record will tolerate a fair bit of detail in this respect. And the good folks at Editor have a fantastic guidance on this, as they do for all other data points. So if anybody's wondering about how to do this properly, they have an excellent 13-page brief for you that has tons of examples and explains exactly how to do this. But the point that's being made here is just to be clear about where your books can be sold and where they cannot, and be comprehensive and detailed in the information that you're putting out there. If you own world rights to that book, and you have the rights to sell it across all territories, it's a simple matter. You just put, what's included, the entire world, and off you go. But for many books, you'll have to parse that down a little more finely than that, and detail the markets that for which you have right of sale and for which you don't. And it's important to transmit that in the Onyx record as it goes out to the international marketplace. The last item on the list here is a feature that's specific to Onyx 3.1, and people call it the market composite, or sometimes block 6 and if you're a real 3.1 nerd. But really what it is a repeatable element in Onyx 3.1 that allows you to be very detailed about the supply detail for the book, for that work, on a market by market basis, right? And you can imagine that that is a super useful facility for things like publication status, publication date, pricing of all sorts, other supply detail that's going to vary from marketplace to marketplace, right? You might be releasing the book in Canada in one season and in the US in another season, right? Or in Europe in another season, right? It's a number of our clients that are very actively engaged in both Canada and the US will stagger their releases in that way, just simply because of market requirements. Like the US wants that title information much further in advance of publication than does the Canadian market. And so there's a natural variability there. And using this market composite, you can reflect that variability right in the Onyx record. And it has the effect of not only accounting for that, but also really allowing you to be more careful about market timing and pricing and other key details as you go country by country, right? So here's what that looks like. This is an example of a market composite. And you'll notice that, obviously it specifies the country that we're concerned with, in this case, the US. It gives the publishing status for the work in that market, in this case, O2, which this is a forthcoming book. It gives the publication date. It gives you some supplier detail in terms of who the publisher is, gives you some pricing detail, things like that. Now, keeping in mind that that's a repeatable element in the Onyx, you can, as many territories in which you're selling this book, you can repeat that composite over and over again and get that nice nuance in for each marketplace, like I say. But the key thing in approaching this part of your Onyx record is to have some really careful discussions with international partners, right? There's a lot of detail that can be supported here. Anybody that's working with distributors in other countries will know they all have their own methods and processes. They have their own requirements in terms of the information that you're going to send them. And so I think the best practice here would be to start by having some careful conversations with those partners in each market in which you're working, and ask them what they want. What do they want to see in this detail? When do they want to see this information? What type of pricing do they want you to provide, right? Talking about automatic transposition of BISAC to THEMA or 2.1 to 3.1. Well, another type of automatic transposition that happens is that international distributors may take your domestic price and transpose it to a price for their market, right? If you don't specify something, that may be their normal process. And that may not be the optimal price for you or for the marketplace. And so this is an opportunity to be more deliberate about that type of thing, pricing and other important aspects of supply detail. So that is this is a particular feature of 3.1. This market composite doesn't exist otherwise in Onyx. And it's a really important capability, I would say, to kind of uncork as you're approaching international markets and thinking about some of the opportunities that you can exploit and reinforce through your Onyx record in this way. So key things there would be to ask distributors, or I would, if it's me, I would start with distributors. But if there are other sort of major data recipients that are on that you know that you're transmitting data to internationally, I would include them in this conversation as well. Ask them what data they want from you in terms of that type of supply detail and how do they want it. Can they process that market composite at a 3.1? Some can, some can't. Before you put any effort into it, you want to make sure that your guys can make use of it. And then what price values do they want? And how best can you either establish those prices or collaborate with those partners around pricing for their local markets. So everybody on this call knows that that type of price detail in the Onyx record, even for the domestic market, feels like it's getting more complex all the time, right? You might have different types of pricing reflected in your Onyx record just for the Canadian market, consumer pricing, library pricing, whatever else. So what do your international partners want in this respect, and how do they want it? That's really the key idea to take away here. Well, in fact, I would recommend you not spend any time working on this at all, except to sort of, do a little bit of background reading on the market composite and some of the options and opportunities that are supported for you in Onyx 3.1 in that respect. Aside from that, I wouldn't encourage you to do any work on this at all until you have those conversations with international partners and really get their guidance on how they want you to approach this type of question. Okay. So that's it. Let me just do a little time check. Oh, doing pretty well. We've just got about, I don't know, 4 minutes left in our session time today. So that's really the end of the road in terms of, I mean, that's enough, I think. Everyone on the call will agree by now. That's enough anyway. But I think we'll stop there in terms of, digging down into any more detail with this. But as previously advertised, there's a set of resource links here for you and in fact, now I realize it doesn't include the sales rights doc, which I really like. I'll tack that on before we send this deck around to everybody. But this is a set of resources that I hope you will find helpful on the regulations that we've discussed, and also some of the other basic aspects of internationalizing your metadata, right? The booknet has this at the top of the list here, has a very persuasive, I think, argument for making better use of Onyx 3.1. Editor, as I mentioned earlier, has tons of documentation. I'm sure most on the call have spent some time wading through some of their detailed guides or other reference materials. And so when it comes to THEMA, for example, they have really detailed reference guides, lookup tables, best practice guidance, lots of documentation around the regulatory environment, of course. And this link at the bottom is a really detailed brief on the market composite that we were just talking about. It's, a lot of these things are easy to understand on first bounce, and I hope that you feel like you have a good sense of them after the session today. But when you actually then put your hands on them and figure out how to express that parameter for a particular ISBN, you get into a bunch of nuance and more detailed questions, and that's where this guidance is just super, super helpful. So I really really commend it to you. So I think I will stop there. We have a minute or two for questions. I see there are questions coming in. I'm going to stop my screen share just so I can take a little cruise through the questions here. And yeah, sorry, I'm just reading some fun comments here. Um, I think because we're close to time, I won't dig into questions too much in the remaining time that we have here, but I'm just reading through them quickly, and there are some great questions here. Let me say that I will undertake to reply to each of these outside the call, and if anyone has any questions that we didn't get to today or that you want to raise otherwise, please feel free to be in touch with the team at LCB. They can pass them on to me or they can address them themselves. And we'll do our best to make sure that you're well supported in any questions that you have coming out of the session today. And I think with that, we should probably close out. I'll pass back to you, Tristan, for any final remarks that you have before we send everyone on their way.
Yeah. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Craig. As we have now come to the end of our webinar, I would like to thank Craig once again for providing us with an excellent overview of the opportunities and challenges in using metadata to effectively promote titles abroad. I also extend our thanks to the interpreters who have provided an invaluable service for us today. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you all for being here with us today, as well as CanExport and the Canada Book Fund for their financial support for this event.
Thanks, everybody. Bye for
Thank
now.
you, everyone. And I'm just going to pop one thing in the chat before everyone leaves. There we go.
Excellent.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again.